all had the prerequisite essential for another evening of dream-telling. A biscuit barrel positively brimming over, with such a selection that would be the envy of biscuit lovers the world over, and assuring that no one in its vicinity be deprived of the particular variety that they crave. Even the dogs were not to be left out. True, they would only receive the biscuits deemed most unappetizing, those that tended to be too dark in their nuance of chocolate colour, and containing supplementary ingredients that had no business anywhere near a biscuit. That orange flavour, as an example, or perhaps coffee. These were the sort of biscuits that one would expect to survive well after all the alternatives had been claimed. Lindsay was back for more. Seemed the hearing of dream-telling was rather an addictive and a regular feature of this evening, for there always were more dreams to recount, the adventures on the real side unceasing, and such a pity to not share them. Many, if not all, were far more exciting than the physical lives we lead, and certainly encouraging for others to follow suit, to sing the New You song, and explore for themselves the endless scope and sheer endlessness of the real side. And so I would begin. I was accompanied by a group, and as we proceeded, a large, elaborately constructed gate came into view. We passed through the opening it presented. No sooner had we done so, that it slammed shut, with a reverberating clang of metal behind us. We moved onward beyond the gate, but curiously I had reluctance to go further with my group. I hesitated, I had doubts, reservations, and turned back, a change of heart it would seem, and I clambered back over the gate, which had remained sealed. Back now on the side of the gate we had initially been on before it had closed. I found I was not alone. What emerged from the gloom was an assortment of monsters, a fearful selection of creatures indeed, wolf-like creatures and beasties, surely the inhabitants of the worst nightmares. They advanced upon me with menace, and yet I would linger. My attention was drawn to the other side of the gate. An individual was there, and clearly astounded at my decision to go back. I had the sense that this individual was a guide, and he was incredulous that I would remain, despite the mass of horrors that were descending upon me. Common sense prevailed, self-preservation kicked in, the want to not be chewed on by all the monsters made for quite the incentive to now scramble back over the gate once again to the monster-free area beyond. The group I had been with had long since departed, as had the guide. My delay had caused me to find myself alone, and unsure of what to do, or where to go. And, on top of this, the monsters were breaking through the gate, mangling and dismantling it, in their want to reach me. Looking frantically about myself, I would call out, requesting assistance, and I received it, in the form of a dim, but yet just about audible voice. I presumed it was the guide once again. He provided direction, and I headed the way he suggested, even as the monsters now had breached the gate, and were biting and snapping at me. His directions led me to another door, with monstrous creatures attaching themselves to my limbs, and hindering somewhat my progress. I made it to the door, shaking my arms frantically, in an attempt to release my hands from the jaws of two creatures that had attached themselves to them. I made it. I lurched through the doors. Safety was now assured, but a nervous few moments followed. I was in a kind of vetting chamber, which scanned each individual, and was designed to determine the purity and sincerity of all those who entered here, and if they were found wanting, they could proceed no further. They would be denied, and presumably have to return to the now monster-overrun area. Relieved was I when I passed the test. I made the grade, and was reacquainted with my initial group. We all now had possession of different bodies, or vehicles, and they were rather interesting in their design, very malleable, and would change and alter according to one's thoughts. Of a curious metallic appearance, but organically so, and not at all rigid like a robot might be. The main feature that separated us all and made us uniquely identifiable were our hairstyles. Each had their own unique style and colour, very bright and extravagant, and no one hairstyle the same. Realizing that I was female now, and on considering this, I suddenly became male, again confirming the flexibility of the vehicles, and how they responded instantly to thought, even to the extent of changing gender. One individual who had had a grievance with another prior to this place and new bodies they now were in, declared his disdain, and his finger, elongated, became needle-like, and extended toward the subject of his malice, and nearly poked out that person's eye. Seems there was quite the learning curve with these new vehicles, and amongst us novices were a few experienced hands that impressed upon us the care we must now exercise in our thinking. that we needed far more control and focus than we once were used to, as the vehicles we inhabited responded automatically to intention, as we were discovering. I must say I was rather taken by my new form, and the extra flexibility and potential it provided, and the setting too. The world we were making the first tentative steps into was pleasing to the eye. Far fresher and more vivid a location, an exuberating, uplifting quality to it, that the earth seemed so very dim and dismal in comparison. Lindsay wanted to know more about this fabulous world and its peoples, and where it might be, and how one might get there. I explained how I had the impression on waking that it demonstrated a crossroads. Where I positioned myself next depended on the decisions and choices I make now. Potentially then, I might end up in the world I experienced in the dream. Evidently a far better position, but should I make a decision, one where I turn back from my process of awareness, as suggested with the gate, then I would possibly find myself in a worse off spot. And, in fact, I had the impression of the alternative place I would have found myself had I stayed on the side of the gate with the monsters. I was female again, but still on earth, and the recipient of unwanted attentions and torments, being raped and the like. The experience demonstrates what happens when you keep going back, returning to old ideas, compelled by emotional attachments. We do have to keep going through it, but painstakingly we see more and more, until eventually we get to the next part, and we do need to get a handle on our attitudes, for rigidly clinging to them can impede our progress, and effectively we bar our own way. The further we go, the more we need the qualities of sincerity and purity. Must be careful of those choices we make. Some are so subtle, but so devastating in their effect consequences, and back into more lifetimes we find ourselves. The whole dream allowed me to have an objective view, to see how I was the decider, and the ramifications for the choices I made. Many people don't even consider their ideas, attachments, and beliefs. But creation is a tough place, and we can end up in places we'd rather not. But we've all done this, and as we progress we become stronger, more adept, and most important of all, more aware through the experiences. And this is what creation is for. Experiences to better become more aware. And despite how tough some decided upon situations or lives may be, we're always okay. I imagined Lindsay would be fascinated by the culture of the curious, malleable people, or perhaps curious as to how many species there are that one could possibly become. But she elected to inquire about the hairstyles. Apparently, of all the information provided through this experience, it was the way that these people fashioned their hair that captivated her the most. At least I hadn't mentioned anything about their attire or fashion accessories. We'd be here all evening, mulling over the details. Lindsay would pause the proceedings temporarily to ask if I still detested my job. The job I had on the physical was tedious, and yes, a cabal job, and like all jobs, was contributing toward the demise of the environment, but my intent was to eventually supersede all these restrictions by recognizing the all is through my awareness. So eventually I would leave all these physical things behind. One day I'd simply need them no more. Lindsay then inquired if the new song and the whole awareness thing was not supposed to improve my physical life. Through awareness, one would certainly see how better to survive realistically on the physical level, but it really was all about the true reality. The main thrust of this golden opportunity was to position oneself in this real reality of light and sound. The physical level was the passing dream, in fact, and the new song wouldn't necessarily improve one's life in the Matrix, more so connecting to the real awareness that would allow better survival in it, and how to navigate through and deal with any and all situations of one's own making or others more effectively. Lindsay clearly had ideas of riches, castles, and fairy godmothers manifesting with the singing of the new song. I suppose focusing on these things may well bring them into someone's life, but what real value were they, if they had no bearing on awareness and perceiving of the is? Lindsay conceded, sort of, and instead of riches, castles, and fairy godmothers, she would settle for a rich tea biscuit, a Lego house, and a goblin to live in it. Seems we were getting a little off track, but the mention of my monotonous job had reminded me of a dream relating to my work. I was on my way to work. Seems the dreariness of the place extended to the real side on this occasion. As the demonstration the dream was designed to provide, I'm sure the real guides had trouble remaining awake as they constructed the dream, incorporating the yawn-provoking nature of my workplace in all its snore-inducing actuality. Luckily, I would never reach the workplace in this dream as things transpired, for I was approaching it in my car, which suddenly suffered a fault or other. It chugged, it coughed, and made a few final death throes and sputters before grinding to a halt. Seems even my car was refusing to go to work, which, ironically enough, wasn't far from the reality of the situation. I managed somehow to get it to a garage where it could be repaired. Mysteriously, the garage was run by strange little people. I would say they reminded me very much of gnomes. I can't say I was especially confident in their car restoration capabilities, but nevertheless, I left it in their minuscule hands. Perchance they may prove me wrong. I retrieved my car a little later, and a little dubious as to if the gnome-like individuals had rectified the issues, but seems I had done them a disservice in my thoughts and opinions. The car, for a wonder, started, and off I went, to resume my journey to my slave duties. I had barely made it a few metres down the road, however, that the car malfunctioned again, and ground to a protesting, gear-grinding, engine-wheezing, white flag-waving halt. Seems the gnomes had made it even worse, and as a result I was unable to make it to work that day. Lindsay suggested maybe I hated my job so much the gnomes had cottoned onto my disdain, and thought they were doing me a favour. I must confess to not being too devastated at my not getting there, but I pointed out that cars generally represent our bodies, our vehicles on the real side, and so the car being deliberately sabotaged demonstrated my body suffering in fact this same predicament. An agreed upon, on my part, debilitation of my body, perhaps, to prevent me getting to work. Suffering such was a small price to pay to disenable my going, or perhaps persisting in a certain thing, a job or whatever, the effects of doing so may be the compromising of the body, stress, overdoing it, and the fact my workplace is bathed in the less than beneficial rays of Wi-Fi. Lindsay asked when I had this dream. I tugged thoughtfully on my ear as I cast back my mind. It was several months ago, and no, seems I hadn't suffered any problems yet that prevented my going to work. Maybe I ought find the biggest reptilian in creation, and ensure that during the encounter I am wearing snake-skin boots, and wearing a t-shirt that bears the message, "Reptilians are dummies." Probably far easier just to drink some tap water, probably among the more hazardous things one can do in this day and poisoned age. Lindsay asked me if I'd ever encountered any especially obnoxious individuals in my dreams. The creational universe was replete with obnoxiousness, individuals entertaining their particular preferred brand of vileness, and generally ensuring everyone else had to experience what they had decided to manifest. Several individuals did spring to mind, those generally to be found sleazing their way along the corridors of agreed-upon power. But obnoxiousness was not only restricted to the physical level. Yes, alas, people of a less than savoury disposition could be found throughout creation. Into the life levels beyond the physical, and we may stumble upon them on the real side on occasion. On the real side, an individual's true self was revealed, laid bare, the mask of social acceptability removed, and very often those which portray a front of decency may be anything but. Here was a dream that demonstrated an example of an individual who most people would not only not wish to meet in a dark alley, but even a very well-lit alleyway with extreme surveillance, a crowd of people, and armed with a taser gun. The individual in question was a heavy-set balding man, and went by the name of Bobby. I'm not sure if he believed such a name, if indeed that was his name, would have a disarming quality, but if so, his aggressive and confrontational nature would quickly re-arm anybody who happened upon him. I was with another person too, a friend from the physical, and we both were the recipient of Bobby's aggressive attentions, as we were hounded and continuously assaulted with relentless animosity. The attack we were receiving spilled out into an open area. This proved rather advantageous for us, but not for our assailant Bobby, because a fleet of spaceships popped into existence in the skies. They had the look of giant Maltesers, spherical, brown, and seamless. They began raining down laser fire on Bobby, much to our relief, and he fled for his miserable life. The scene switched then to an airport setting, and Lindsay was there. Funnily enough, while in the dream, we both recounted our experience to her, describing it as a dream experience. The scene changed yet again, a laboratory setting now. I was trailing my friend from earlier, following him down the twists and turns of the medical facility. But at one point I lost sight of him, and found myself isolated, and suddenly challenged by a white coat wearing, so presumably a scientific individual of some description, female. This female seemed to have a peculiar quality about her, which caused me to slip into a mysterious trance-like state. During my trance, she revealed to me all manner of informations, but unfortunately my dozing mind was unable to grasp much of what she was uttering. Something about meditation, but rather vague. Seems this dream was featuring quite the assortment of friends and relatives, as suddenly Gwen, my mother, was there, and attempted to shake me from my slumbering trance. She was unable to do so, and I found myself sinking deeper into this state. Then I would awake. Lindsay was about to speak or ask something, but I raised a finger to halt her words. There was a little more to divulge. On waking, I found myself in a state of paralysis, an experience many may be familiar with, and perhaps nothing to be overly concerned about, but in this case, the cause of the paralysis seemed to be stemming from the leering menace of a bulky form that filled my doorway. Yes, Bobby was back, and here on the physical, in my very room. Frustrated at my inability to extricate myself from my seemingly invisible bindings, I had the awareness to sing the New You song, and a frozen O of surprise on Bobby's less than pleasant face as he faded from sight, and I was rendered free from my shackles. Lindsay was pretty shocked, and nodded emphatically, as I suggested this was similar to the stories you hear of paralysis in alien abduction cases. But maybe then the New You song could possibly free an individual in those circumstances too. I ran a hand through my hair. The memory of Bobby was still fairly prominent, even after the months it had taken place. But it was just an experience, like any other. I was, in every sense of the word, a risk-taker, going through my adventures. I couldn't deny that I liked the adventure, the risk. I had grown up with sci-fi movies, Indiana Jones, and Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. So there was a part of me that was more than willing to become more aware in this particular way. And the end result was, everything was fine, and I was okay. Lindsay asked if she featured in any other of my dreams, and I had to smirk, as I informed her that she did indeed. She often seemed to be running rampant, like a screaming harpy, and attacking me, when I dared even mention the new presentation and the new sound. I was quick to add, under her glowering stare, that in recent times she was far more receptive to what I was speaking of, and I had been wondering at what stage it may filter through to the physical personal her, and seems, based on her willingness to listen now to our real side dreams, that it had. Most people are self-convinced and routined, but it's always worth taking the risk and floating a few new yous into earshot, a few choice words, phrases. It was going in somewhere, and may manifest some day. A part of everyone would and must see and understand it, the real individual, but the personal self may brush it aside and disregard what would be the most crucial information they'd ever come across. The physical, personal self can be of a particular, but always the real self is fine. Bringing anything through from the real side requires agreement, and it's all about intent. For me, my intent is to discover and find something, and with Lindsay, she can listen and accept what is said on the real side, but has to have the intent to bring it through. If the intent isn't there on all levels, then it can't come through. The individual will care not a jolt. It's there, but must be nurtured. Lindsay was glowering at me, slightly less now. She could have fried a chicken with her eyeballs just now. But sometimes you had to get your information across. Maybe I ought work on the tactful means of my delivery, but sometimes you had to just call things for what they are. To emphasise this point, I suggested Gwen's t-shirt had the most boring design on it I'd ever clapped my eyes upon, and yes, she was a little dismayed at this news, but at least she might select a better design of shirt in the future. How many people had muttered under their breath and in their minds about the awful nature of that particular item of attire, while all the time Gwen was thinking the opposite. And so, through directness, I had instantaneously enhanced and elevated her fashion level. Did you ever consider where all your thoughts and projections go to? This I would inquire of Lindsay now. She shook her head, shrugged, and dismissed the consideration as the inconsequential thing that it, at least to her personal self, was. I would then go on to inform her of how all the thoughts and fantasies all went somewhere. Some would manifest as temporary creatures, roaming about the astral, as an example, because although thoughts seemed fleeting and seemed very insubstantial on the physical level, on the real side things were somewhat different, as everything moved by thought and imagination there, and loose, unchecked thinking could give rise to monsters. She scoffed at this somewhat, but undaunted, I continued that obsessive-compulsive thoughts, and especially those held by vast swathes of people, could not only create astral critters, but could give rise to entire dimensions, actual worlds, where, if aligned with, through focus, one could find themselves in, at a future life. I suggested the possibility of all the football fanatics winding up on a giant football, spinning in space. I wasn't exactly selling the viewpoint with such possibilities, but nevertheless, anything was possible in creation, and the combined force of all the desire, fixation, and infatuation on a certain thing could almost certainly create a world along the same lines. To speak of it, and to picture giant football planets and various other possibilities was one thing, but validation was required. We needed evidence indisputable, confirmations undeniable. We needed the irrefutable real side to reveal unquestionably what was real now. Dwayne had mentioned also how the computer gaming industry was so intensive with the focus of millions, and that the computer games and virtual reality were actual dimensions created by the controllers. So I would produce a real-side dream experience to exemplify all that I had just mentioned. I found myself in a dimension or world, and it was exactly like the computer games enjoyed by billions the world over. Dragons, monsters, and all manner of creatures abounded. Fierce battles, treasures to be won, status to be gleaned, wizards, warlocks, sword-wielders, and rogues, all in the mix. All the creatures and roles were assumed by actual individuals, born into this world like any other. So, naturally to them, it would be their normal. It's as though they were plugged into a computer game from birth. So, a computer game within the Matrix simulator we already are in. And, as in regular computer games, you can be smited by dragons, eaten by goblins. In fact, every monster-related ill fate imaginable can befall you. And in this world you also had the luxury, if it could be considered such, of starting again. Death by orc wasn't the end. No, no. You rebooted and began again. You didn't pass over to your next position and life on who knew what planet in creation. For these unfortunates, they had an infinite set of lives, as far as I could ascertain. Perhaps at one point they would pass over, but imagine being trapped in a world like this for eternity. As I observed the battles and the mayhem, I imagined the response were I to mention to these peoples, assuming they could put their cutlasses and magic wands down long enough to listen, that there are worlds out there where you have only one life, and should you fall foul of a blade, you'd be passing on to another life position. They would think me quite mad for even suggesting such a thing. Maybe try locking me in the witch's castle. Although in this dream I was perfectly safe and removed from the struggles. I was merely in an objective, observing capacity. I hoped I had impressed on Lindsay that this was clear evidence that all the compulsive computer game fanaticism had indeed spawned entire worlds and dimensions, and if an individual was unable to extricate emotional attachment from such games, then such a world would be a potential viable position for them in a future lifetime. The games of this nature are set up to be obsessive in their lure, and much psychological distortion has surely been the result for billions of people the world over. It is kind of a setup then, like the enticement of overstimulated taste sensation through the flavour-enhanced foods available. Cell phones and games, yes, these are a hook. Nonsensical distractions. You can get locked into these games, a little like that demonstrated in the movie Tron. The controllers control the masses with such things. And all these games go into the subconscious. What the conscious mind thinks about it is irrelevant, that it's only a game, etc. The subconscious can't differentiate. It just takes it all in, and not forgetting all the subliminals that are in the games too. Through the games therein lies agreement to the distorted structure of the world, and they wish to perpetuate this. The killing that frequents the computer games, how you receive a new life each time should you be slayed, can have then children and adults going forth and replicating the game's contents on the physical level, actually killing others and dismissing it as irrelevant as the games they play. The idea of having more lifetimes when you die goes into the subconscious, guaranteed to bring you back lifetime after lifetime. So even when the individual passes over, they are already set up in the agreement of future lifetimes, and so they do, continually under control, and endlessly in future lifetimes under the thumb of the controllers. Yes, the gaming industry is all black magic. And do you see the birds and animals playing games? There is more than just the draw of the phenomena in creation, but oh, how easy it is to get caught up in it. Sure, you can play these games if you choose. You can become the conscious effect, but as you become more aware, you will get to the point where you no longer need this phenomena, when you stand real with the is and see as it does. Addiction leads to distorted emotional stimulation, depressions, even suicide, catered toward the demise of the individual. For going around killing things, even in a game, isn't natural, and does not make sense. So yes, they are constantly making new worlds in cyberspace, according to what people are deciding, and the people can get trapped in them. Lindsay wasn't completely convinced about worlds being created through gaming, but as she wasn't much of a gamer, it didn't really apply to her, or need cause her concern. The only thing she especially liked to do was make cupcakes. These were of an exceptional quality, it must be said. I had to assure her then that no, I couldn't imagine her ending up on a planet made from cupcake sponge. Although not the worst place to end up, possibly. At least there were not monsters at every turn, and you certainly wouldn't get hungry. You'd just eat some of the ground any time you had the need. Although I'd watch out for the custard lakes, as they may invariably have similar qualities to sinking mud. Death by custard, a rather ignominious way to perish. I wouldn't want that inscribed on my gravestone. Peter was dubiously studying his bottle of beer in a suspicious, will I end up on a planet made of beer cans kind of way. I wished I hadn't even mentioned the means by which worlds can be created. though it made for entertaining pondering. What with people chasing taste sensations, eating, and the heavy marketing that accompanies it, as an example, lended to the potential for all kinds of confectionery-orientated star systems. A dimensional alternative of the Milky Way, with chocolate overtones, and of course a galaxy far, far away from what would be considered healthy. Well, my round of dream availing was complete, but the evening was not concluded yet. All eyes were on Peter. The dog's eyes were too. Although that might be due to the fact that Peter was the most likely source of scraps. A very generous scrap distributor he, and so Peter would take the floor.
Lindsay turned to me and asked, "Is it only since you got involved with the new UU thing that you've had strange dreams?" "No," I said. "All my life I can remember having the occasional vivid and strange dream that I've never forgotten." "Oh, like the guillotine one you mentioned the other day. Tell me what happened." "Well, it was many years ago I had that dream. I was standing next to the guillotine, talking to the executioner, and generally feeling quite enthusiastic. I'd always wondered what it would be like to be beheaded, and by then it seems I was already not afraid of death, but looked on it as an exciting adventure. I was strapped into position, and the neck grip snapped into place. I heard the blade swishing down, and then experienced a falling sensation as my head dropped into the awaiting receptacle. Oddly painless, I thought, but they always reckoned that if you didn't black out due to the sudden drop in blood pressure, a numbing safety valve would set in, like when people lose limbs in war or accidents. Still in the head, I was expecting to have leapt free by now and got on to a better place, but nothing happened. Suddenly I felt trapped, and for the first time fear set in. Then what happened? I woke up. Wow. Quite. What did Dwayne make of that? Actually, I haven't yet run that one past him, tending more towards discussing recent dreams. Do you think it was a past life thing? I've often wondered, but can't think where or when it could have been. France, presumably. I asked John about guillotines. John is Lindsay's husband. Not necessarily. Many European countries use them from the 1800s to fairly recent times, especially Germany and Austria, where it was called the Fallbeil, or falling hatchet. I've always thought I was in the USA in the 1800s. I've always loved New York. What about the early 1900s? That, as they say, you really don't want to know. Oh, go on, tell me. Perhaps another time. One other old dream I have run past Dwayne concerned Loch Ness. It was probably in the 1960s to 1970s when I had this one, when I was a frequent visitor there, later with your mum, in my Nessie hunting days. In the dream I was alone, standing on the southern shore, the quiet side, when I was suddenly aware of a huge airship of the proportions of the famous Hindenburg before the war, coming past from the Inverness end and about only 100 or so feet up. Suddenly it plunged down into the loch and disappeared from view. I stared in disbelief. Then there was a huge disturbance in the water, and my stomach turned over, half expecting one of the beasties to appear. Instead, the nose of the airship broke the surface, and finally the whole airship reappeared, with water cascading off it, levelled up, and continued its journey as if nothing had happened. End of dream. What did Dwayne make of that? That basically it was intended to divert my attention. The airship, and indeed the so-called monsters of Loch Ness, represent something hidden and alien in creation. He thought that Callum God had noticed me even then and marked me down as a future problem. Although I didn't realise what was going on at that time, I do now. What about recent dreams? The most recent strange one I had concerned my being in some unfamiliar house in a narrow corridor. I was standing looking at a man and woman who seemed terrified at seeing me. I realised I was standing in a kind of Y attitude, arms up, hands touching both walls. One of the two then said, "It's the devil!" I looked at my arms and saw they were insect-like, oddly scrawny, and ended more in claws than hands. I appeared to be white as snow. I found myself thinking, this isn't right, I'm a good person, and that's where it ended. Dwayne said this was clearly set up to see how I reacted to it, and was either an experience I needed to decide who I am, or maybe the influence creating a diversion. It is an opportunity to take an objective view to decide for myself. As an afterthought, and I did not mention this to anybody until now, I cannot help feeling this is a throwback to my last life before this one. I continued. Another recent dream found me up on a motorway bridge, the sort that are walkways for people from the services stops to get from one side to the other. I was standing at the top of the grassy embankment where the bridge joined it, clinging to a girder flange running along the bottom of the bridge. I knew for some reason I had to cross the carriageway, hanging by my hands from the girder, hand over hand. I knew equally that the first time I put my weight on my first hand I would be down amongst the speeding traffic. I knew I had no choice in the matter, and was terrified at the thought of falling. As I said, I'm not afraid of death as such, but I would rather be guillotined than be smashed up by a bunch of idiots exceeding the speed limit. What did Dwayne have to say about it? In his view, the bridge represents moving from one position onto another. Clearly this is necessarily at a slow pace by myself and has to be done on my own. It is undoubtedly scary, but I am doing it. The dogs were getting a bit restless, and we decided to end it there for this evening.